This lecture is going to be on Hurston's, some of her, I'm calling it Hurston terminology, but really it's, excuse me, just some words that you've heard, and I want to make sure that we understand them in terms of Zora Neale Hurston's narrative, her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. So let's go through some of these basics. And so I want you to take notes while this lecture is taking place, just like a traditional classroom. So you've got your piece of paper out or you've got your computer open, and I'm going to go through these one at a time. And just make sure that you have or that we all have an understanding of how these terms are used in regard to studying a piece of writing like Zora Neale Hurston's. Incidentally, I did want to tell you that in the 30s, when Zora Neale Hurston's novel was published, even though she's an anthropologist by education and a writer by talent and trade, her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, was not well received during the time period, especially from her cohorts. Her colleagues thought that it was a novel that pandered to kind of the the traditional stereotype of African Americans, kind of we're happy and kind of happy and foolish and silly, and they laugh a lot, and they're kind of just living stereotypes. That's the way her colleagues thought she treated the characters in her novel. They thought that she should have portrayed a more dignified version rather than the folk version that she elected to choose. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, she was a smashing success, because really she was writing during the time of kind of a renewal and a reemergence or an emergence of art in the Black community. So I don't know. So she's writing kind of against the current, I guess we could say. Most of her creative colleagues were trying to uh, sort of reinvent Blackness, so that, not reinvent it, God, portray it in a way that couldn't be consumed, in a way that made it seem sophisticated, like white art pieces supposedly were. Boy, I'm taking forever to say that. So let's talk about these basic things. We all know when we say the term culture, it's like, oh, I don't need that explained to me. I know what it's like. I know what a lot of people say Americans don't have a particular culture. And I don't know. Let's look at this. So think about this. Culture is everything that human beings and maybe even other living things do that's motivated by natural instinct. Or I should say, I'm sorry, that is not motivated by natural instinct. So sleeping is natural. All living things need to sleep. Sleeping is natural. It's not cultural. But sleeping using a pillow is cultural. I love my cultural pillow. Laughing is natural. Laughing at a knock knock joke is cultural. And if you've been around little kids, that's one of the first joke forms they learn to tell when they're like, I don't know, 2 years old. They learn a few knock knock jokes, and you can never get away from them. They love those knock knock jokes. So culture includes tool making and using. Culture includes creative and artistic expression. Culture includes language development and use. Culture includes the formation of beliefs and values. Culture is also a word that we use to describe groups of individuals who share common cultural traits. They could differ in some ways, but they might share common traits. So tradition is meaningful cultural behavior or lore. We'll talk about the difference between lore and narrative in just a minute. So tradition is exhibited kind of in a continuity over time. In other words, over several generations. It continues in space or among other folks. It's an adjective. I should say the adjective traditional is sometimes synonymously used with folk, like a folk narrative, a traditional narrative. So we would say that Sleeping Beauty is a traditional narrative or folk narrative, and they mean kind of the same thing. So Sleeping Beauty is not a true story, it's kind of a folk narrative. A narrative, here we are here, is any kind of story. almost always involving, it's got some kind of plot, whether it's a sequence of casually linked things or logically linked events. It's got characters who both enact and react to the plot. And it's got stories that usually involve some kind of conflict, right? And it might have bits and pieces of Freytag's dramatic curve period, but not all of them. We know this is a modern novel, so it isn't going to necessarily adhere to the traditional dramatic curve. Different cultures, this is really important, have different sense of storytelling. In other words, what's considered an appropriate narrative and what is not. This sense of story is different in different cultures. I want to get into the concept of orality. That's the quality of anything that's spoken, chanted, recited, sung, or read aloud rather than written down or read quietly. Think about most Americans, the way we have been sort of educated is we don't really communicate as much in spoken, chanted, or recited, or sung, or read aloud objects, rather than we sit quietly when we read. We don't read aloud usually. We're sitting alone somewhere reading, and the narrative is taking place in our heads. So orality is white culture has for a while thought, well, anything that's performed can't be as engaging or permanent as something that's written down. But oral tradition has carried many, many cultures through way before writing ever, was quote unquote invented. Performance, let's talk about that. It's an essential artistic dimension of anything oral. Performance refers to either an individual rendition or a traditional narrative. Okay, it could be a song, a dance, or a drama, and it could be a unique variant of a work performed. I can see my calendar up here. So performance is not fixed in print. All right, it's not even always. It could be the same. It could be the same, let's say, script, but every time it's performed, it's different. Okay, so a performance is always kind of organic. It has the quality of a more, let's say, a more polished piece. It's not, I guess, as spontaneous. So it refers more broadly to aesthetic features, like things that can't happen in print. So a story can be told in a way that's performed. And performative features include a person's tone of voice. That can't be captured in print, really. Their dynamics, the pacing, the interaction with an audience, the kinesthetic gestures, what they're doing with their hands, arms, or body, and their costume. So there could be some performative dimensions of, say, even Little Red Riding Hood. Think if somebody was going to tell the story of Little Red Riding Hood, they might adopt the distinct voices and gestures for the different characters. Kind of keeping in mind how the age of their audience when they're listening to that narrative. A variant is any version of a folk or traditional narrative that bears a striking resemblance to another version of that narrative. We've been used to hearing the word variant. This is really going to pound a stake in the timeline here. We've been hearing about variants with COVID, right? There was the Delta variant, and there's the Omicron variant. So they're versions of COVID-19. They're not singularly the same. They have a small difference. There's a variation, okay? This is a word that I hope that you remember forever. Etiology, or some people pronounce it etiology, really means any explanation, whether it's in a narrative form or not, for the origin of something. So it could be, in many cultures, there's like an Adam and Eve or a beginning of the earth story. It's not just the Big Bang or the Bible, and did God, make the earth in 7 days or 6 days or however many it was. Most cultures have some kind of creation story, all right? And that would be their etiology, their etiology. Okay, so I want to talk about the difference between, let's break up the word folklore, all right? Because we use that phrase, and honestly, I think we use it kind of casually. It was first coined, the word folklore was first coined in 1846 by a person named William John Toms. He was a British person who studied antiques. And folklore can be divided into two component words like folk and lore. So folklore is all the lore shared by a particular folk. Okay, so who are the folk? Who are the folk? Well, there's the folk group, right? Any two or more people who share at least one significant cultural thing in common. The things that a folk group shares in common are often traditions, okay? And they help create this shared identity for the group and its members, which in turn helps the group kind of become long lasting. It'll endure over time. Almost all of us belong to at least a few folk groups, and many of us belong to many more than that. It's interesting that some folk groups are really broad and diverse. You could say all Americans or even all students at the same school are folk groups, while some are really exclusive and specific, like groups of best friends. There's two best friends. All right, that's still your folk group. The more cultural factors a folk group shares, the more traditions they're likely to share as well. That's interesting. So the more cultural factors we have in common with people, the more traditions we're going to share. So, it's like people will make generalizations, let's say about Irish Catholics. Irish Catholics who live in the same town, work in the same discipline or fields, worship at the same church. They're probably all more likely to share the same lore than, say, a Catholic business executive living in Dublin or a Catholic peat farmer in a rural small village in Ireland. All right, then let's talk about lore. That lore is the traditional behavior of the material shared by the members of the folk group. So lore includes but isn't limited to these following things. Traditional narratives, and those could be epics, magic tales, legends, and I'll go over these. Could be the lore could also include traditional costumes, or maybe it's uniforms or hairstyles. Traditional beliefs could include religions, superstitions, or ethical values. Traditional non-narrative speech, slang, jargon, nicknames. When I taught in person, I felt like I had this insider's view, or not view. I got to hear the slang and I don't know, the way that teenagers speak. I felt so proud of myself that being a college instructor, I learned all kinds of new slang every year. So, and every year it changes, of course, or every couple years. So what might have been cool, you know, um, a slang term, 2 years ago is not necessarily the same now. All right, there's also the lore or the traditional culture also includes maybe their architecture or their folk art. We might say, I don't know, I don't want to put, um, I don't know, for some reason when I thought traditional material culture, architecture, folk art, I kind of thought of the totem poles, and I don't know if I'm putting them in the right category or not. There's also traditional calendar customs, like the way that these different cultures celebrate holidays or festivals or birthday parties, and there's traditional music and dance, like folk songs and folk dances. Um, I think that the most important thing to remember is that lore is traditional. It has continuity over time and through space. Something like a hairstyle is in fashion for a short while. It's not traditional. Okay, tradition lasts and has meaning for a particular group over the long haul. One of the things that my family practiced, my husband is Danish, and so when their Danish people dance around the Christmas tree, on Christmas Eve, and they sing a song that goes "Nu have julen." I don't know. It's a Danish song, and they hold hands. They dance around the Christmas tree. They have to pull the Christmas tree away from the wall. Put a little rug over the extension cord to the lights, and they hold hands and they dance. Just kind of all around. And then as they sing these Danish songs, Danish kind of Christmas songs, you switch directions and it gets faster and faster, and that's the fun of it. So even though my children are only half Danish, my children, they're now, all in their 40s, they and their family want to continue that practice of dancing around the Christmas tree. So anyway, it's really cool that they have that traditional, you could say that's a music and dance. It's a calendar custom, and my children looked forward to it every year.